quite a few years ago now, I was a very inexperienced communications officer at the Kathrada Foundation. And Uncle Kathy decided he's not going to oppose the renaming of de Klerk Boulevard at the time. And I was very nervous about putting out the statement because I felt that we're going to be called not progressive enough, and Uncle Kathy is going to be criticized for, in a way, showing a bit of support to de Klerk by saying that, yes, we recognize his role in apartheid, but we must also recognize his role in ending apartheid. And there must be a recognition of both. I was very nervous for the foundation as well, and what would be the criticisms that would be leveled against it. It certainly didn't reflect popular sentiment, but it did raise an important question in post-apartheid South Africa. That yes, we must recognize the injustices of the past. We must deal with the systemic racism that still exists in our institutions. But should we continue vilifying white people? And in this instance, the very face of apartheid, and Uncle Kathy was making a case that we shouldn't. For me, this brings to mind the recent interview by Andre de Ruyter and the type of vilification he faced, particularly from the ANC. And this was not only during the end of his term at Eskom, but during his time there as well, and the lack of support that came through. So to defend our democracy, we issued a statement. We said that this kind of vilification is unjustified. But at the back of my mind when we put out this statement was, are we going to be called not being progressive enough on this issue? And it does beg the question. I ask myself that, did race matter in the way in which the Ruyter was treated? I have no problem with people critiquing his time at Eskom. I think that that's necessary. But the same language used to vilify the Ruyter, will this be the same language that is used, for example, against people within the ANC or connections to the ANC who may have done worse at Eskom? And this should lead us to question what we mean by a progressive politics. Perhaps those who once represented the ideal of a progressive politics aren't so progressive anymore. What does this mean in the context of a mayor in Cape Town who's just fired his MMC after a little bit of an investigation, a report comes through, and there's a firing that takes place? Yet we see that there are people who are implicated in the Zondo report that within the governing party still hold some position or the other. And I think that this speaks volumes in itself. Like the de Klerk example above, there are a few other moments where Uncle Kathy took a very principled stance that was unpopular. Uncle Kathy, over and above writing that very famous letter to the former president, signed a Save South Africa pledge, and this pledge demanded honest, accountable, open and responsive leadership. At that time, I remember that there was all sorts of criticism being flung about at Save South Africa. They were called, for example, it was said to be that this was a big business initiative pushing a particular agenda, very much like the Bell Pottinger rhetoric that we're now familiar about. But Uncle Kathy supported this initiative. He attended one of the events that took place at Constitution Hill. And it was in line with the stance of the letter that made both him and the Kathrada Foundation unpopular in some quarters. Some at the time felt that the foundation was being too political, that we would get our hands burnt because we were being critical of the ANC, and very few at the time were prepared to do this. But Kathrada's voice, that of Sipho Pityana and a few others, were amongst the very select that were beginning to speak out. But that played an important role. It played a catalytic role and paved the way for others within the ANC, within other civil society organizations, to come out and to speak out against the president who had failed to uphold the constitution, to recognize the extent of capture and corruption that occurred during his tenure, and also how this posed a threat to democracy. So today, what are the threats to our democracy that we need to be vocal about? Sean mentioned earlier the statement that we put out with a range of organizations on the national shutdown and the related forms of intimidation and fear-mongering that accompanied it. But the undertone from some civil society organizations was that we weren't being progressive enough. Again, I question, what does this notion of progressive mean? Does it mean that we must allow almost fascist-like fear-mongering to count as the right to protest? Does progressive mean that we can't speak out against the EFF or any other political party because we're afraid we'll be labeled something or the other? Uncle Kathy and Barbara Hogan took a stance and they voiced their disapproval about the South African government denying Dalai Lama a visit for Archbishop Tutu's birthday celebrations. Again, it wasn't a very popular stance because we had to maintain good relations with China. In today's context, we need to ask ourselves, do we need to be doing military parades with the US after they've invaded vast parts of the Middle East? Do we need to be doing military parades with Russia as they currently invade the Ukraine? And as we await the visit by President Putin to South Africa with the ICC now having pronounced against him, this debate is going to become even more fierce. On a lighter note though, in relation to international politics, when former President Mandela passed on, I was with Uncle Kathy doing a range of interviews. And there was a French journalist who phoned and said, will South Africa's democracy be under threat now that the former president has passed away and Mandela was the founding father of our democracy? And Uncle Kathy very coolly asked the journalist, why are you asking me such questions about South Africa when in France at the moment you're trying to ban the hijab? So as democracy globally and around the world, I think there are similar issues being faced. As it comes into question, we must ask, what do we envision as a progressive politics? For the moment, for the immediate, as we fix our country, I think it's not too difficult to say that people can work together to fix their potholes or to get accountability in their communities without some of these ideological issues being at the forefront of what needs to be done to fix the country. Yes, ideology is important, but sometimes we need to do what needs to be done to fix up. How do we get to a point where things are measured by the impact they will have on people, rather than whether it fits a shallow understanding of what constitutes progressiveness? As I look back, I recognize that the stance by Uncle Kathy on numerous occasions was not always popular. All who see themselves as truly progressive today, and this is not the narrow version of the word that we are accustomed to, must expect criticism and the cold shoulder as we continue the road ahead. Lastly, given the crisis that we face and the difficult task of fixing this country, I thought it apt to end by a quote from Lord of the Rings, and I'm sure that it would have been as applicable in Uncle Kathy's time as it is now. So Frodo, who's the hobbit that's now doing a particular mission in the book, says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. And Gandalf, who's the wizard, says, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what we do with the time that is given to us. And I think Uncle Kathy, Auntie Sophie, Andrew Mlangeni, and others here have demonstrated what they did with their time. And now we have to decide what we do with our time. Thank you.